Hello everyone, I'm Juliana Bell, and later you will get to hear from Noah Gleason, and we will be talking about a very important British Navy commander, Horatio Nelson, or First Count Nelson. Just a brief bio about him. Horatio Nelson was born in 1758 in Norfolk, England, located on the eastern side of England off the North Sea, which you can see here on the map. He was born into a large family, and he was the sixth child out of 11. He entered the British Royal Navy at the age of 12 and had his first experience at sea on board a ship with his uncle, Captain Maurice Suckling, who had taken him in after his mother's passing. Suckling became one of Nelson's mentors along with Captain William Locker and Admiral Samuel Hood, who all had connections, and they were the reason for Nelson's future success. At the age of 19, he passed the examination and became a lieutenant and set sail for the West Indies in 1777 during the American Revolution. By the age of 20, in December of 1778, he was commanding his own ship, the Badger Brig. Sadly, during the same year, Nelson's uncle, Maurice Suckling, passed. In March 1785, at the age of 29, Nelson traveled to the island of Nevis, where he met a widow, Frances Nisbet, and her 5-year-old son, Josiah. Horatio Nelson and Frances got married 2 years later in 1787, and they moved back to England. Nelson was unemployed for 5 years after returning, but then was given command of the 64-gun Agamemnon, which would become Nelson's favorite ship that he would sail for the rest of his life and career. Nelson fought his remaining battles during the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. Horatio Nelson was and is a celebrated British commanding officer, and his war tactics are studied across the world, specifically here in the US. 3 traits that have defined who he was throughout history are that he was fearless in battle and had aggressive naval tactics. He was extremely ambitious, which was driven by his eye for honor and glory, and finally, he was a flawed man. First, when people elaborate on Nelson's fearlessness, it comes from his courage. Nelson was a type of leader who led from the front lines. He never backed down, even when orders were given to do so. He saw that victory could still be achieved in a few instances when everybody else was backing down, and Noah will dive into those later. His courage went even further. He would board enemy ships and capture multiple during a few battles where it was hand-to-hand combat. He risked his whole life each time, and every time he was greatly outnumbered. Nelson fought until his death with courage, despite losing sight in his right eye and the amputation of his right arm, and it never stopped him from doing his duties for his country. Nelson was also charismatic, and many would say he had the Nelson touch. With his charisma, he used his own injuries from battle to bring humor to his crew. During one of his battles, he became almost completely blind in his right eye, and in a later battle, he ignored an order and held up a telescope to his right eye and made the joke, "I have a right to be blind sometimes. I really do not see the signal," humorously making a joke and then actually ignored the order. Englishmen then turned it into one of their famous phrases, which many of you might know as turning the blind eye. And that's not something people expect from a great leader like Nelson. But Nelson was also deeply loyal to his men and his country. He cared for each one of his men and showed this by making connections with each crew member, gaining their trust and loyalty, leading his crew to perform the best in all the British Navy. To follow after his courage and fearlessness, he was adaptive in battle with his aggressive naval tactics. Horatio Nelson proved his intelligence and courage during the Battle of the Nile, where he sailed between enemy ships, which was not the original plan, but he saw it would work best during the battle. He proved it again at Trafalgar, where he ended up being shot and killed by a French sniper. He was also very ambitious, driven by honor and glory. Nelson had a desire to be the best. He even wanted to die in battle so it would be a glorious death. He wanted to be known as the man who took down Napoleon by eliminating his Franco-Spanish fleet. Through this, he would also reestablish the British Navy as supreme over the French. He may have wanted his name to also be known for doing it. Finally, Horatio Nelson was a flawed man. Though he was a great leader at sea, Horatio Nelson fell victim to lust, then ultimately adultery. In 1793, Nelson met the Hamiltons. Not too long after, they became close friends. By 1799, Nelson and Lady Hamilton were in the middle of their affair. A year later, Sir William Hamilton, Lady Hamilton, and Nelson all moved to Naples together, and by this time, Lady Hamilton was pregnant with Nelson's child. Lady Hamilton's husband, Sir William, knew of the affair but didn't seem to care that much. Nelson then chose to stay with Lady Hamilton and left his wife, Frances. While Nelson was at sea, Lady Hamilton gave birth to a daughter, Horatia. Nelson came back and was able to spend time with his new child until he was sent off 18 months later. Sir William died in 1803, and the three were more like a true family now, which shouldn't have made it any better. The three only spent a few months together in 1805 before Admiral Horatio Nelson was killed in battle.
One of the earlier battles that is attributed to Horatio Nelson's rise to fame is the Battle of Cape St. Vincent of 1797. Under the command of Sir John Jervis, Nelson had the opportunity to show his prowess in the battle as a captain. The fleet was dispatched from Cadiz under the admiral for battle, and on February 14th, Jervis engaged the Spanish admiral Don José de Cordoba 15-27. Jervis, though, was confident in the rate of fire and seamanship of his British fleet, even against near 2-1 odds. Because of this, he decided to engage the enemy by breaking the Spanish line, and the order was to follow through with the formation. However, Horatio Nelson, near the back of this line, recognized that once the formation concluded, the Spanish ships may have favorable wind and be either able to flee or launch a countermeasure. Because of this, he broke rank. Nelson was correct, and because of this, his ship ended up meeting up with the Spanish fleet. However, as a lone ship, they were in a very vulnerable position. But even in this danger, Nelson chose to board the enemy ship, the 84 guns. San Josef collided with the San Nicolas and was promptly taken as well. This maneuver of boarding a ship by taking and crossing another became known as Nelson's patent bridge for boarding first rates. To look at the battle as an overview for Nelson, he ended up disobeying the signals that his admiral had given him, which was very uncommon for that day and age, as captains in the Navy were expected to follow the admiral's order to a T. But in doing this, it ended up in the way that Admiral Sir John Jervis had wanted, just not in the way he had initially intended. Nelson's one ship fought against 7 all at once, and won in part to Jervis's thought of the British guns and skilled seamanship giving them an edge in the battle. And, lastly, Nelson boarding and capturing 2 Spanish ships. A battle of Nelson's during the Napoleonic War is the Battle of the Nile of 1798. Nelson, aboard the Vanguard, set sail with the command to hunt down the French and Napoleon along Gibraltar. Napoleon sought to invade Egypt and move through India to destroy British positions. But Nelson had limited information, which made the French fleet very difficult to find. Though after difficulty and wrapping around a second time to Egypt, he found them near Alexandria in Abu Qir Bay. The French admiral François-Paul Boëdi had made a line along the shore, and when they spotted each other, the French sought a battle. This may have been because of the advantageous position of the French fleet and dusk being upon them. When the battle took place, Nelson saw an opening between the French line and the shore, and he sent his ship, the Goliath, in between and caught the French completely off guard. Because of this, the French fleet was sandwiched by over half of their ships between the British, and as the battle went on, the victory became increasingly imminent. The French commander, François, would not surrender even to the point of his ship falling apart. But the battle finally was over when his burning ship split in 2. Of the 2 ships that did escape, one carried Paris de Villeneuve, who later commanded a part of the French and Spanish fleet off Trafalgar. Because of this battle, Napoleon was stranded in Egypt, which greatly limited his ability to put pressure on Britain. Another famous battle is the Battle of Copenhagen of 1801. In March, under the command of Admiral Sir Hyde Parker, Nelson set sail from Yarmouth, England. The goal was to find a peaceful solution to the issue caused by the Russian Tsar, Paul I, who had made an agreement of neutrality with Copenhagen, Denmark. With the British differences between Russia and them, and the Navy's resources coming much from Denmark, this was possibly a very dangerous situation. Hyde, seeking a resolution, loomed in the area of Copenhagen, during which the city placed defenses in the event of a battle. Once no solution was in view, Hyde sent Nelson into Copenhagen. The battle proved difficult due to the well-protected city, and Admiral Hyde, seeing this, gave the command to fall back. But Nelson's famous blind eye, where he continues battle against orders and he points to his eye as though he did not see the command, continues the battle. When a weakening in the Danish line appears, Nelson sends a letter on a ship to the Prince of Denmark. This letter contained information on a truce with the threat of burning Danish ships with the people on them. The battle came to a close, and Nelson went ashore to secure a truce between the Prince of Denmark and Britain. Horatio Nelson's final battle, the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. One of the greatest battles recorded between Admiral Nelson and the Spanish and French admirals Don Federico Gravina and Pierre de Villeneuve took place. In October, the combined fleet left Cadiz with 33 boats, 18 French and 15 Spanish. Admiral Nelson had also spent much time on the seas with his officers and Admiral Collingwood, holding meetings and discussions to be on the same page as his fleet. This would go on for hours, continuing what was known as the Band of Brothers. He was very famous for this, and the impact brought many victories on the sea. Admiral Collingwood led first and broke the line. Nelson followed close behind, and a battle took place just past noon. After roughly an hour had passed, Nelson received a serious bullet wound in his left shoulder. He was taken below deck and administered to. He is remembered well for his last hours by his surgeon, stating that he did not want priority in getting medical attention, but instead continued to serve on a first-come, first basis, which is a naval tradition. His last words recorded in a journal touched on his love for Emma Hamilton and Horatia, his daughter, and the quotes, "Thank God I served my country," and his good friend, "Kiss me hearty." His friend reportedly kissing him on the forehead and on the cheek before returning to the war. From here comes the painting, The Death of Nelson, 21 October 1805, where it portrays him below deck with an array of his officers and shipmates as he's dying. In this battle, 17 French and Spanish ships were taken with no ship casualties for the British, but Horatio Nelson was lost. The king and the people, after finding out, were full of grief over a naval hero like Nelson being lost. The legacy that followed Nelson was significant. Nelson already was considered a hero, but his death brought the rise of what some call the cult of Nelson. His death touched the nation as a martyr, and he was given a state's funeral that was regularly for royalty. His last words being, "Thank God I served my country," and "Kiss me hearty," left deep impressions on the people of Britain. These words not only being circulated because of his death, but also to frame him as an inspirational Christian nationalist and a sacrifice for the sake of Britain. The effect of this cult of the martyr brought a renewed belief in the worthwhile cost of war and his strong memory engraved in the people of courage, resilience, and naval supremacy for Britain. One of the darker portions of his legacy, that is attached more to Nelson than to his cult sentiment, is his affair with Emma Hamilton in 1798. This was sought to be covered up, but because of it being plain enough to see for many, it was something that is now well circulated and known. Another is when he executed rebels that were captured in an intoxicated state shortly after his affair. Emma Hamilton, having political ties and great motive to influence Nelson to execute the rebels, had great influence. Though the darker sides of Horatio Nelson can be seen as a stain on his memory, much of what affected the people shortly after was very positive, even to the point of decades later having Nelson's column being put up and being the reason for Britain's century-long naval superiority. Nelson's column is a monument in Trafalgar Square in the city of Westminster, London, built to honor Admiral Nelson and the legacy of his heroism. Having this put up further establishes the sentiment of courage, decisiveness, and Christian nationalism. The man atop the column remains there today, 170 feet closer to the heavens than the people he once stood with.